Hey, it's me, Jason PB. Now today I'm going to use small but powerful incremental adjustments to drastically improve the results of this hazy photograph using the Effects and Detail panel, which are two features of Lightroom CC that, although they're not new, work together seamlessly to powerfully alter the final image. Essentially, we're going to combine contrast, sharpness and noise for a drastically different photograph. You may find these areas of Lightroom useful when working on a photo like ours, something hazy, distant or just lacking contrast and definition. Now, sometimes haze actually enhances an image, but in our case, we have a couple of people towards the right of the frame that we want to highlight. The mountains behind them are shrouded in cloud, which makes them less impressive, so we're going to give this shot a boost for a more striking result. So the first slider we come to in the effects panel on the right is the clarity slider. Now, clarity works by introducing mid-tone contrast. So to increase the mid-tone contrast, slide the slider to the right to have a positive value. Now this gives strong definition in the mid-tone shades rather than the highlights or the shadows of the image by increasing the pixel's relative brightness and darkness. But be careful not to overdo it. This is a very powerful tool, as you can see with me going to the right and to the left here. So obviously the left, it makes it look a lot less clear. But I'm going to add about plus 30, and you can either slide the slider to the right or you can click over here where the numbers are and just type in on your keyboard and hit enter or return. The next slider is the dehaze slider, and if I hover over this word here, you can see a small animation that shows that it either increases or decreases the amount of haze in your image. Now this slider was introduced back a few years ago, but new users of Lightroom who've only recently upgraded may find this very useful indeed. It's a powerful and very selective localized contrast effect which analyzes the image before working on it. Here I'm going to increase the dehaze, and you can see that working on the shot there to take away the haze. Now of course if you go to one extreme or the other, the photograph becomes unusable, so you have to give a very soft effect here like this. I'm just going to add, I think, around plus 25, and you can see that definition coming in there. If I take that back to 0 compared to plus 25, like that. So we're already starting to get increased contrast in our image. But the edges of the frame are quite bright, and actually our eyes are drawn to the brightest part of an image, and here it's kind of in the clouds and a little bit on the edge of the waterline here on the beach. So we need to bring that attention back down to the mountains and back down to the center of the frame so that our eyes can flow in towards the people. So we can use a vignette. Now you may have used this before. If you add a positive value to your vignette, you get a white fringing around the outside, and a negative introduces a dark or a black fringing around the edge. And this is used to just draw the eye in, so your eye isn't drawn to the brightest part of the image at the edge of the frame, it's now brought to the center. But we have lots of options here with the vignette. We have feather, which if I just turn vignette to its most extreme, you can see that it blurs the transition between the edge of the vignette and the edge of the frame. If I reduce that, it's a lot harder. But we're going to go for a softer transition because we don't want it to be too apparent. And just for now, I'm going to leave the vignette on -100 just so you can see what's going on with the image. Now the midpoint determines how far into the frame it creeps, and obviously if I whack that down to 0, it's coming right into the center of the frame. If I take it out to 100, it's going right to the edges. So you have to decide where you want that to lie. It's completely subjective. Personally, I like quite a soft gradient that comes in to about a third of the way into the frame. So I'm just going to add a slight negative value there. So that's 41. It doesn't actually display as negative because it's between 0 and 100, but I'm going to bring that down to 41 off of the default 50. The roundness slider obviously changes the shape, so from square to perfectly round, and we have a landscape image here, so it doesn't need to be perfectly square, but also I don't want it to be perfectly round because then we have the top edge of the frame, which is still bright. So I'm going to bring that down, and actually it was almost there on 0. I'm just going to bring that up to about 20. I'm going to type 20 into the box and hit enter. And the highlights are just to save the highlights in the vignetted area, and I don't actually want to do that because I want to reduce the highlights around the edge, but you may find that that's particularly useful for your shot, for example. And I'm just going to go back to vignette, and I'm going to change that to about -30-ish, I think. Maybe a tad darker just to bring that in. I'm going to go -35 and hit enter. Now the next panel is the detail panel, which is actually below the effects panel, but I've left it uncollapsed because it's quite useful for using it in tandem with the effects panel. From this panel we can increase sharpness, we can change the sharpening radius size, control all of the detail sliders accurately, and alter the threshold of the areas not affected with the masking slider. And actually, if I zoom in on the image, you can see that perhaps the figures in the shot, although they're quite small, aren't as sharp as I'd like, and this is probably due to the haze in the shot itself. And you can see there's not a lot of definition to the rocks, even though we're zoomed in at 100%, it's still not a lot of definition. So I'm going to just sharpen this up a bit by bringing it up higher. And you can see all of these small sort of grainy crystallized noise artifacts in the image, and I would say that it looks a little bit too fine for me. Zooming out, you can see that the image itself is quite distant, quite large, and we've got some mountains there, and it's only when you zoom in that you see this fine detail. So I'm actually going to increase the radius. I'm going to push it up to the maximum, and you can see the difference between having a low radius and a high radius. It just takes the edges of the pixels and it either sharpens it on a very small scale like this or a larger scale, and actually that looks a lot better having a higher radius. I'm going to say a radius of about 2, because you've got these contrasted edges here, which when we zoom out, we're not actually looking that closely at them, but the entire image itself is slightly sharper and slightly clearer. So I'm going to put sharpening at 100, radius at 2. If I come back in again, you can see the detail will be just how intense that fine sharpening is, and to be honest, it's pretty good as is, so I'm going to leave the detail slider at the default 25. But there are areas of the mountains here that don't really have any detail in, but we somehow have these sharpening artifacts appearing. So one way of getting rid of this is by using the masking slider, and if I slide that to the right, you can see, especially in the top bit of cloud up here, that the sharpening is taken away quite a lot. If I whack that up to maximum on 100 on this masking slider there, you can see that that's taken quite a lot of that sharpening away, probably too much, I would say. So bringing that down to 0, just give it a go, just fading it in and seeing where the threshold is for your image or your eye and what you like personally for your finished shot. I'm going to go with about 35 there on the masking slider. Next is the noise reduction slider. Now there are many options in here which I won't go into, and you can have a little go at that yourself. They're all self-explanatory, as we saw in the detail slider in the detail panel up here under the sharpening. We have detail and contrast again, and that is just detail is acting in the same way, and the contrast we have learned from clarity and in our previous tutorials in the light panel about contrast between light and dark. So I won't go into those in this tutorial, but the noise reduction is very useful because now that we've sharpened the image, and even though we've added some masking to the detail, we notice these crystallized glass-like artifacts, and it almost looks like you're looking through a bathroom window that's slightly opaque. And this doesn't look very good. It looks, well, it kind of looks high ISO-ish, but it doesn't look very good. So I'm going to introduce some noise reduction, and if I put that up to maximum, it works in a similar way to masking, but actually it's a much more dramatic and powerful effect. As you can see here, it almost looks painterly now, and it really does affect the final image. This doesn't look very good at all, whacked up to maximum. So you need to be careful with this. Just add it sparingly. If I take that down to 0 and again fade that in, I think that looks good around there, about 36. So we still get these sharp details around some of the edges and the people, but we're actually getting rid of the noise introduced by the sharpening elsewhere in the cloud and the mountings and even in the sea. So I'm going to zoom out again. Color noise reduction will help to tone down the color noise, usually more apparent in JPEG images rather than RAW. But we can see if I zoom in and increase this color noise reduction, particularly in the green coat here, we're getting rid of a little bit of chromatic, not chromatic aberrations, but sort of chromatic artifacts within the sharpening process that have come out in the colours. Obviously this is a very blue, very pale image, so we're not going to get too much of a problem here, but I think just introducing a little colour noise reduction helps a bit. Now, after reducing the noise in an image, as I said, it looks crystallized and glassy, so at this point it's worth adding some noise back in, or as the slider is named, some grain. Now, it may sound crazy to add noise after removing it, but trust me, this works. The grain slider introduces a uniform and controlled grain across the entire image, which looks much nicer than the original noise we removed. Plus, we can vary the amount to as much or as little as we like. So if I zoom in and increase the grain slider up to maximum, you can see this completely uniform grain across the entire image, and it does look different to the artifacts we were getting before from introducing the sharpening and even with the noise reduction. And this is a much more pleasing image quality of grain, because it mimics the old style filmic effects of grain. So obviously that is a bit intense, but it looks a little bit too clean without it, so I'm going to introduce some grain here. And I think about plus 30. Plus 30 works really well. And you can't really see it when you're zoomed out, but when you come back in, especially if you're doing like a big print or something like that to hang up on your wall at home, you're going to notice this grain, and it's going to look a lot more authentic. So feel free to throw the sliders around and see what they do. Don't be afraid to push them to one extreme to the other when starting out, as this will give you a better idea of how they influence the final image.